plants, but they are all, like I say, fairly easy to grow. And the most important thing probably is to understand the proper watering on these plants. Now, some varieties of orchids grow with relatively moderate amounts of light. No orchid wants to grow in a real dark area. They all want a bright area. But the two probably best types to grow in your home that you can grow in a sunny window are the Phalaenopsis, and if you look inside on your way out, you'll see about 20 different colors of Phalaenopsis. They're probably overall the easiest of all orchids to grow and stay in bloom for the longest period of time. The second is your little Paphiopedilum. These guys tend to grow down on the floor of the jungles where they don't get as much light, so these are ones that you can grow, you know, very, very easily in a sunny window. And indoors, you really don't have to have a greenhouse, or it's nice if you have a patio where you can put them in the summer months, but it's not absolutely necessary. Most of the other orchids, whether it's the Cymbidiums, which are very bright light orchids, the different types of Oncidiums, the Cattleyas, which are your big corsage type orchid, while they're in bloom, they can stay inside your home and they'll be pretty, you know, and last for quite some time. But if you're going to get them to bloom over and over, you've got to have brighter light. And if you have an orchid that hasn't bloomed well for you, it's probably simply not getting enough light, because bright light is the secret to growing these things and having them bloom well. And like I say, the Phalaenopsis and the Paphs are the two that will thrive with the least amount of sunlight. And there are people, years ago I made a videotape for the American Orchid Society on growing with artificial lights. We visited people up in the northeastern part of the country that have collections, literally hundreds of plants that they grow in sunny windows in their home or on benches where they put artificial lights on them, and they're almost exclusively Phalaenopsis and Paphiopedilum. So if light is an issue, those are the two types that you want to start with. Now once you get started with orchids, you'll be building a greenhouse one of these days, and then you can switch over and grow a lot of these others. But understanding the amount of light is really pretty important. Fertilizer, all orchids are fairly heavy feeders, and remember that the more light any plant likes, but it's especially true of orchids, the more light any plant likes, the more fertilizer it likes. Now, Cymbidiums are one of the brightest light orchids. Like I say, they grow these things in sunny flower beds in Southern California. The species that these originally came from are native to the foothills of the Himalayas, where they actually get a little snow every now and then. They rarely get a hard freeze, but anyway, these things take a lot of cold weather. But any plant that likes a lot of light will be a heavy feeder. Use a product like, we've always used the Has-to-Grow type fertilizer on the several thousand that we have grown. And with something like a Cymbidium, you mix it fairly strong and you use it every time you water. Phalaenopsis, if you're going to use it every time, you make it much more dilutely, a teaspoon or two per gallon of water. Or you can make it more concentrated, maybe put an ounce to a gallon and just fertilize them about every 2 weeks or so. But remember, these things are not growing in soil for the most part, so they're not getting nutrients out of their medium, so to speak. So you'll have to supplement the fertilizing, so to speak, by putting a pretty fair amount of fertilizer in the water and using that fairly frequently.
Is it better to spray them then?
That's a real good question, and the answer is no. But there are people that do that really give them a lot of foliar feeding. And one of the better growers in the country is an interesting fellow who works for USDA named Rob Griesbeck. And I was at a lecture Rob gave one time, and he was talking about foliar feeding of orchids, because a lot of orchids these days come out of Taiwan, where they do a lot of foliar feeding. But Rob's comment was that a plant, an orchid plant in particular, but I think it's pretty much true of all plants, a plant will only grow as big a root system as it needs to support itself. And we've always grown the orchids in fir bark, and I mean our plants have an incredibly heavy root system on them. The plants that come out of Taiwan, where they're doing basically all foliar feeding, it'll be a great big plant with a tiny, dinky little root system, and consequently the plants don't really survive very well when you get them home. So I am a big proponent of fertilizing the roots of the plant, because you want a good heavy root system if you're going to have a plant that really will grow well and be quite hardy.
So then those air roots are really not feeding the plant?
Oh no, those are. Spraying fertilizer on the roots is fine, but spraying fertilizer on the leaves is not the only way to fertilizer. No, I think of, you know, putting the liquid on the roots, whether they're in the air or in the pot, you know, as being basically the same thing. That's what you really would rather do with orchids rather than just spraying the fertilizer on the leaves only. Even though, like I say, the ones come out of Taiwan Sugar Company are virtually all just grown with foliar fertilizers, but you get them and they just tend to go straight downhill when you get home with them. I look for a plant that has a good heavy root system and you'll be a lot more successful with it over the long run. Yes?
My orchids are in a pot that has a hole in the bottom. So when I fertilize it, should I put a little dish under it for a while so it could absorb the fertilizer versus it throwing it all back on?
You can do it either way. You can just let it run through, or you can just plunge them down in it, let them soak for a few minutes, and then take them out. I've seen it done both ways. If you have 10 orchid plants, it's great to just put them down and let them sit down in the dish for a little while. If you have 10,000 plants, you're not going to want to do that. You're going to want to get out and get it done as quickly as possible, and the plants seem to be very happy either way. Question? Yes, sir.
We live down the Rio Grande Valley, and we have these beautiful trees that bloom from time to time, and they call them an orchid tree.
Yeah. They're Bauhinias. We have a big one in the parking lot right up there, but they call them that only because the flower looks something like an orchid.
They're beautiful.
Yeah, they are not related to orchids in any way, form, or fashion.
Okay.
You want to know what makes an orchid an orchid? Just a little bit of botanical knowledge for you, if you like. You know, plants are always classified by the structure of their flowers. And when you look at most flowers, I'm going to go run get a hibiscus flower or something, but the male and female parts of the plants are separate. The pollen forming structure is the male part of the plant. The pistil of the plant is the female structure. And typically your stamen, your pollinia will be up like this, and the pistil will be right in the middle. The thing that makes an orchid is that the column, the pistil, and the stamen are fused into one structure. And you can have orchids that, well, they don't look anything like you think of an orchid. But this little structure right here in the center, right on the bottom of that is where the pollen is, and right underneath that is the stigmatic surface. But if the column and the stamen are all in one structure, that's an orchid. That's what makes an orchid an orchid. And if you're looking at your tree flowers, or if you're looking at anything else and you think, gee, I wonder if that's an orchid, if the pollinia are out here and the pistil's here, it's not an orchid. It's what makes an orchid, all 40,000 different species, is that the male and female parts are fused into one structure. A little bit of trivia for you. Okay, back to growing these things. The most important overall cultural thing is that the potting medium stay fresh. Come on in. The potting medium will tend to break down and deteriorate over time. You'll know that the potting medium is starting to break down if the pot doesn't seem to be drying out, if it seems to be holding a lot more moisture. If you were to take it out of the pot, you would find that the bark had become just kind of almost sticky, just almost rotting, just much more like a kind of a muddy substance than a nice loose open bark. The two times that you need to repot an orchid are when that potting medium is breaking down, or when the plant begins to grow over the edge of the pot. I guess that's one other thing I ought to talk about before I talk about repotting, is the two different growth habits of orchids. Many kinds of orchids, including the Phalaenopsis, the Vandas, the Ascocyndas, Orynchostylis, these are things that we call monopodial growers or one-footed growers.